My sister and I hated each other until we found Mom's second phone. 200 texts to Dr. James. He's not a real doctor. He's her stepbrother. I found the phone behind our washing machine on a Wednesday morning while looking for my missing work scrubs. Purple case, cracked screen, 47 unread messages lighting up when I picked it up. My sister Natalie and I had spent 23 and 25 years respectively trying to destroy each other over grades, guys, and Mom's attention. But when I saw the name Dr. James with a stethoscope emoji and opened the first message, our war ended instantly. Missing you already. Last night was incredible. Can't wait until next weekend when your husband is in Chicago again. I screenshot it with shaking hands, texted Natalie, who hated me, and wrote 4 words that changed everything. Found Mom's affair phone. She arrived at our house in 12 minutes, which meant she'd run at least 3 red lights from her downtown marketing job. I met her at the door with the phone and watched her face go from suspicious that this was some elaborate prank I was pulling to pale white as she scrolled through messages. The texts weren't thousands going back years like you'd expect from a long affair. There were exactly 200 messages, all from the past 6 weeks, starting the day after Mom came back from Grandma's funeral. Every single message was explicit, detailed, planning their next meeting. Dr. James talking about missing her touch, about hotel rooms, about how wrong this was but how right it felt. Mom responding with equal intensity, saying she'd waited 30 years to feel this way again. Natalie's hands shook as she scrolled. This just started 6 weeks ago, after the funeral. She looked at me with confused horror. Who goes to their grandmother's funeral and starts an affair? I took the phone back and kept reading. That's when I found the message that made everything worse. Mom had written, "I can't believe after all these years you're still Jamie. Still my Jamie. Even if we're not supposed to be." Dr. James had responded, "We were never really siblings. Our parents' marriage doesn't make what we feel wrong." I looked at Natalie. Dr. James isn't a doctor. It's Jamie, Mom's stepbrother from when Grandma was married to his dad, the one she grew up with from ages 12 to 17. Natalie grabbed the phone and scrolled faster, finding the message where Mom had saved his contact as Dr. James with the stethoscope emoji. It was deliberate misdirection in case anyone saw the name on her phone. Jamie had joked about it in one text, saying, "At least if someone sees you texting Dr. James, they'll think you have a medical issue, not that you're sleeping with your stepbrother." Mom had responded with a laughing emoji and, "You always were clever. That's what I loved about you when we were kids." Natalie looked like she might be sick. They knew each other as kids. They lived in the same house as teenagers. This isn't just an affair. This is incest. I wanted to argue that technically it wasn't incest since they weren't blood-related, but the semantics didn't matter. Mom had grown up with Jamie as her stepbrother from age 12 to 17. They'd lived in the same house, eaten at the same table, been raised by the same parents even if those parents weren't biologically theirs. And now, 30 years after their parents' marriage ended in that violent divorce Mom never talked about, they'd reconnected at Grandma's funeral and immediately started sleeping together. The wrongness of it sat heavy in my stomach. Natalie kept scrolling and found messages about their teenage years. Jamie writing, "I wanted you even then, but we were kids and it was impossible." Mom responding, "I used to lie awake knowing you were just down the hall and hate myself for what I was thinking. This has been building for 30 years. Natalie's voice was hollow. They had feelings for each other when they were teenagers living in the same house and now they're acting on it. She found another message where Mom talked about how she'd married Dad at 21, partly to get away from the confusing feelings she had for Jamie. How she'd spent her whole marriage wondering what might have been if their parents hadn't divorced and split the family apart. Jamie had told her he'd gotten married twice trying to forget her, but no one ever compared. These weren't just affair messages. These were messages from 2 people who believed they were soulmates kept apart by circumstance and social taboo. I took the phone and scrolled to the beginning, reading the first message Jamie had sent 6 weeks ago. "Saw you at the funeral today. You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I know this is crazy, but I had to tell you." Mom's response came an hour later. "I've thought about you every day for 30 years. I need to see you." They'd met for coffee 2 days later. The messages showed them talking for hours, sharing their marriage's failures, confessing feelings they'd both buried for decades. By the end of that first coffee, they'd agreed to meet at a hotel. The affair had gone physical within a week of reconnecting. Every message after that was planning logistics, stealing moments, expressing feelings that had been suppressed since they were teenagers. But what made my stomach turn wasn't just the affair or the step-sibling connection. It was a message from 3 weeks ago where Mom told Jamie, "I'm going to leave him. I can't keep living this lie now that I know what we could have." Jamie's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Really? You'd actually do it?" Mom wrote back. "I've been researching divorce attorneys. I want to do this right. I want us to be together openly. I don't care what people think anymore." They'd been planning Mom's exit from her marriage, planning a future together as a couple. Natalie read over my shoulder and I felt her tense. She's leaving Dad for her stepbrother. This is going to destroy him. That's when I noticed something that made everything worse. I scrolled back through the messages and counted. 198, 199, 200 exactly. The affair had lasted exactly 6 weeks with 200 messages. That was it. This wasn't some long-term calculated deception. This was a whirlwind reconnection that had spiraled into obsession in a month and a half. Mom and Jamie had spent 30 years apart, reconnected at a funeral, and within 6 weeks decided their teenage feelings were worth destroying 2 marriages over. The impulsiveness of it somehow made it more disturbing. These were 2 50-something adults acting like lovesick teenagers without considering consequences. Natalie pulled out her own phone. "We need to tell Dad. Right now. Before this goes any further. Before she actually files for divorce and blindsides him." I grabbed her wrist. "Wait. If we just tell him, she'll deny it. She'll say we hacked the phone or made it up because we don't like her. We need proof that's undeniable." Natalie stared at me. "We have the phone. We have 200 messages. What more proof do we need?" I thought about it. She could claim the phone isn't hers, that someone planted it. We need to catch them together. Prove this is real and ongoing. Natalie looked at the messages again. There's one from yesterday. Mom telling Jamie she'd see him Friday night at the Riverside Hotel, room 303, while Dad's at his medical conference. That's tomorrow. Natalie's voice was flat. We follow her tomorrow and get proof. Then we show Dad everything. I nodded and we put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, behind the washing machine in that nest of cords. We spent the rest of the day in this strange, suspended state, both of us processing what we'd discovered. That night at dinner, I watched Mom serve Dad his favorite meal, watched her kiss his cheek and ask about his day, watched her play the role of devoted wife while planning to leave him for her stepbrother. Dad talked about his upcoming conference in Chicago, completely oblivious. Mom smiled and said she'd miss him. The lie was so casual it made me want to scream. Natalie and I met the next morning to coordinate. We'd follow Mom separately in our own cars so she wouldn't notice one of us tailing her. The Riverside Hotel was downtown, easy to stake out. We arrived at 5:30 and parked in the back lot where we could see the entrance. At 6:02, Mom's white Mercedes pulled up. She got out wearing a dress I'd never seen, her hair styled differently, looking nervous and excited. She walked into the hotel with a small overnight bag. At 6:08, a blue Ford truck pulled up and a man got out. Tall, gray hair, probably mid-50s. He looked around like he was worried about being seen, then headed inside. That was Jamie, my mother's stepbrother, the man she'd grown up with from age 12 to 17. Natalie had a video camera she'd borrowed from her marketing firm. She filmed Mom entering, filmed Jamie entering 5 minutes later. We waited 30 minutes, then I went inside while Natalie stayed with the camera. The hotel lobby was generic, all neutral tones and fake plants. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked past room 303. The door was closed, but I could hear voices inside, low and intimate. I stood there for a moment feeling sick, then headed back down. When I got to Natalie's car, she showed me what she'd filmed. Clear footage of Mom and Jamie both entering the hotel separately within minutes of each other. Now we wait for them to leave together. That'll be undeniable proof. We sat in that parking lot for 2 hours. At 8:47, the hotel entrance opened and Mom and Jamie walked out together. They were holding hands. Jamie kissed her in the parking lot before they walked to their separate cars. Natalie filmed all of it, got them kissing, got them looking at each other like teenagers in love, got them reluctantly separating. When they drove away in different directions, Natalie lowered the camera. She actually looks happy. That's what makes this so fucked up. She looks happier with him than I've ever seen her with Dad. I didn't know what to say because Natalie was right. In that parking lot footage, Mom looked genuinely joyful in a way I'd never witnessed in my entire life. We drove to Dad's hotel where he was staying during his conference. He was surprised to see us but let us into his room. His conference materials were spread across the desk and he looked tired. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" Natalie pulled out her laptop and showed him the phone messages first. We watched his face change as he read through the affair texts, the declarations of love, the plans to divorce him. His hands started shaking when he got to the messages about their teenage years, about how they'd had feelings for each other when they lived in the same house as kids. "Who is Jamie?" His voice came out hoarse. I took a breath. "He's Mom's stepbrother. From when your mother-in-law was married to his father. They lived together as teenagers." Dad's face went gray. "She's having an affair with her stepbrother?" I thought I might see disgust or anger, but what I saw was defeat. 27 years of marriage, and she leaves me for someone she knew as a kid, someone she grew up with. Natalie showed him the video footage from tonight, Mom and Jamie at the hotel, holding hands, kissing in the parking lot. Dad watched without expression. When it ended, he sat down heavily on the hotel bed. "How long?" 6 weeks. Since Grandma's funeral. I showed him the message count. Exactly 200 texts. Started the day after she got back from the funeral. Dad laughed, a bitter sound. 6 weeks and she's ready to throw away almost 3 decades. Must be some kind of record. We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Dad stood and pulled out his phone. "I need to call my attorney. If she's planning to file for divorce, I need to protect myself." He looked at us with something like gratitude. "Thank you for telling me. I know it couldn't have been easy to bring this to me." Natalie's voice was soft. "We're sorry, Dad. We didn't want this to be true." Dad managed a sad smile. "Neither did I. But at least now I know. At least I'm not being blindsided." He called his lawyer and we heard him explain the situation in clinical, detached terms. When he hung up, he told us his attorney was filing for divorce on Monday morning. Dad wanted to beat Mom to it, wanted to control the narrative and protect his assets before she could make her move. The weekend was surreal. Dad stayed at his hotel finishing his conference. Natalie and I went home and pretended everything was normal when Mom returned Friday night looking happier than usual. She hummed while making dinner and asked about our days with genuine interest. The affair with Jamie had transformed her into someone lighter, less burdened. It would have been nice if it wasn't built on betrayal and lies. On Sunday, Dad came home and I watched him and Mom move around each other in their normal patterns. He didn't confront her. He waited. On Monday morning, a process server arrived at Mom's real estate office and handed her divorce papers. We got the call from Dad an hour later. It's done. She's been served. Mom came home that afternoon and the transformation was instant. Gone was the happy humming woman from the weekend. She stormed into the house and found Natalie and me in the living room. "You told him." Her voice was shaking with rage. "You went through my things and told your father." I stood up. "We found your phone. We read the messages. We know about Jamie. We know you've been planning to leave Dad." Mom's face went through several emotions before settling on defensive anger. "What I do in my marriage is none of your business. You had no right to invade my privacy." Natalie stepped forward. "You had no right to cheat on Dad with your stepbrother. You grew up with Jamie. You lived in the same house. How is that not completely wrong?" Mom's expression shifted to something almost pleading. "You don't understand. Jamie and I were never really siblings. Our parents got married when we were 12, but we weren't related by blood. We didn't grow up together from childhood. And we had feelings for each other even then, but we couldn't act on them because it would have torn the family apart. We spent 30 years apart trying to move on, and we couldn't. What we have is real." I felt anger surge through me. "You've been married to Dad for 27 years. You have 2 daughters. You have a life. And you're throwing it all away for someone you haven't seen in 3 decades because you had a crush when you were teenagers? That's not real. That's delusional." Mom's face hardened. "I gave up my entire life for your father. I put my dreams on hold to support his medical career. I raised you girls while he worked 80-hour weeks. I've earned the right to choose my own happiness. Jamie understands me in ways your father never has. He sees me as more than just a doctor's wife or someone's mother. With him, I'm just me. And that's worth more than a marriage that's been dead for years." Natalie made a disgusted sound. "So instead of getting a normal divorce like a normal person, you started sleeping with your stepbrother and planned to leave Dad for him? How did you think that was going to go? Did you really think people wouldn't judge you for that?" Mom stood up, her voice rising. "I don't care what people think anymore. I've spent my entire adult life worrying about appearances and propriety and doing the right thing. For once, I'm doing what I want. Jamie makes me happy. He always has. And I'm not going to apologize for finally having the courage to choose myself." She grabbed her purse. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight. We can figure out the rest later. But you two need to understand that this isn't some sordid affair. Jamie and I love each other. We always have." She walked out and we heard her car start in the driveway. Natalie looked at me. She actually believes this is romantic. She thinks she and Jamie are some kind of star-crossed lovers. The divorce proceedings moved fast because Dad had filed first with evidence of adultery. Mom tried to claim the messages were private and shouldn't be admissible, but Dad's attorney argued that infidelity was relevant to asset division. The judge agreed to review the messages in chambers. When he saw that Mom's affair was with her stepbrother, with someone she'd lived with as a minor in the same household, his expression apparently made it clear what he thought of the situation. Mom's attorney tried to argue there was nothing illegal about 2 unrelated adults having a relationship, which was technically true. But the judge wasn't impressed with the optics. The divorce was granted with Dad keeping the house and the majority of their shared assets. What made everything harder was that Mom didn't hide her relationship with Jamie after the divorce was finalized. Within a month, she'd moved into his apartment in Boulder, Colorado. She updated her Facebook relationship status to "in a relationship with Jamie Sutherland" and started posting photos of them together. Her real estate firm asked her to resign because the scandal was affecting business. Clients didn't want to work with an agent whose personal life was tabloid fodder about affairs with stepbrothers. Mom acted like she was being persecuted for being in love. She posted long defenses on social media about how she and Jamie weren't blood-related, how their parents' marriage hadn't made them real siblings, how love doesn't follow society's rules. The comments on her posts were brutal. People calling her disgusting, saying she'd groomed Jamie when they were teenagers, accusing her of inappropriate behavior. Mom had to make her accounts private after someone found old family photos showing her and Jamie together at age 15, looking close in a way that people interpreted as inappropriate. Whether anything had happened between them as teenagers became the subject of speculation. Jamie's ex-wife gave an interview to a local news station saying Jamie had always been obsessed with a girl from his past, but she'd never known it was his stepsister. She said Jamie had photos of teenage Mom that he'd kept, that he'd compared her to Mom constantly during their marriage. It painted a picture of obsession rather than romance. Natalie and I had to deal with being the daughters of the woman in that scandal. People at work asked intrusive questions. Friends wanted details. Extended family took sides, some defending Mom's right to happiness, others calling her selfish and disturbed. Thanksgiving was awkward because half the family refused to speak to Mom while the other half insisted we were being judgmental. Christmas was worse because Mom brought Jamie and expected everyone to welcome him. Dad's side of the family obviously didn't attend. My uncle told Mom she'd embarrassed the family and she left in tears with Jamie, posting about being rejected for loving someone. The victim narrative never stopped. 6 months after the divorce, Mom called me wanting to reconcile. She said she missed us and wanted us to understand that she and Jamie were happy. She invited Natalie and me to visit them in Colorado. We declined. Mom sent a long email explaining that she'd given up so much for her marriage to Dad, that she'd sacrificed her dreams and her youth, that finding Jamie again had been like being given a second chance at life. She wrote that they planned to get married now that both their divorces were final. She wanted our blessing. I wrote back a single line. You had an affair with your stepbrother and destroyed our family. We're not giving you our blessing. Mom responded that we were being cruel and would regret pushing her away. A year after everything exploded, Mom and Jamie got married in a small ceremony in Colorado. She sent us photos. They looked happy in that uncomfortable way people in their 50s trying to recapture teenage romance look happy. Mom wore white, which several family members commented was inappropriate given the circumstances. She posted photos all over social media with captions about true love and second chances. The comments were still mostly negative, but Mom had cultivated an echo chamber of friends who supported her narrative. Jamie posted long defenses of their relationship, talking about how they'd loved each other since they were kids and society's disapproval wouldn't change that. It was embarrassing to watch two adults in their 50s act like rebellious teenagers. Dad moved on more quietly. He started dating a colleague from his practice about 18 months after the divorce. She was a nurse, divorced with 2 grown kids of her own. They bonded over having complicated exes and the challenges of starting over in middle age. When Dad introduced us to Patricia, she was warm and normal and didn't have any scandalous secrets involving former stepfamily members. At their wedding 2 years later, Dad made a speech about second chances and finding unexpected happiness. He thanked Natalie and me for having his back when everything fell apart. He said sometimes the worst betrayal teaches you who really matters. Mom wasn't invited to the wedding. She sent a passive-aggressive text saying she was happy Dad had moved on like she had. Natalie and I had to rebuild our relationship with Mom slowly and with boundaries. We agreed to see her a few times a year, but we didn't attend family events with Jamie. We couldn't get past the strangeness of their relationship, the way it had started, the damage it had caused. Mom accepted our terms because she didn't have much choice. She'd burned most of her bridges, and we were the only family still speaking to her. During visits, she'd talk about her life with Jamie, about how they were finally living their truth, about how much happier she was. Sometimes she'd say things that made it clear she didn't regret any of it. She'd chosen what she wanted, and everyone else's feelings were secondary. 3 years after finding that phone, Natalie and I were having lunch at our regular spot when she asked the question we'd both avoided. Do you think they were actually in love when they were teenagers? Or is this some kind of shared delusion they've convinced themselves of? I thought about it while stirring my coffee. I think they probably had feelings for each other as kids that got magnified over time into this epic romance narrative. They spent 30 years building up what might have been instead of dealing with reality. And when they reconnected, they acted on it without thinking about consequences. Natalie nodded slowly. So basically, they blew up their lives over teenage feelings they never got over. That's somehow sadder than if it was just a regular affair. I agreed because she was right. If Mom had just had a normal affair, it would have been easier to understand if not forgive. But this situation was complicated by history and emotion and feelings that had been festering since adolescence. Mom and Jamie had convinced themselves they were meant to be together despite all evidence to the contrary. They'd destroyed 2 marriages, alienated their children, and become social pariahs because they believed their connection was more important than anything else. Whether it was actually love or just obsession wrapped in nostalgia didn't really matter. The damage was the same either way. Natalie took a bite of her salad. Do you think we'll ever really forgive her? I considered that. Maybe eventually. But I'll never understand her choices. And I'll never be okay with what she did to Dad. The thing that still bothered me most was the 200 texts. Such a small number compared to what you'd expect from a years-long affair. Mom and Jamie had reconnected, reignited feelings from 30 years ago, and decided to blow up their lives based on 6 weeks of messages. 6 weeks of stolen hotel meetings and declarations of love that were probably more about nostalgia than reality. If they'd had 2,000 texts over 2 years, it would have shown sustained connection. But 200 texts in 6 weeks showed impulsiveness and poor judgment. They'd made life-altering decisions based on the emotional intensity of a reunion, not on any real assessment of compatibility or consequences. It was reckless in a way that would have been foolish for 20-year-olds and was pathetic for 50-year-olds. But Mom and Jamie were still together 3 years later, still insisting they'd made the right choice, still posting about their love story on social media to an increasingly indifferent audience. Maybe they really had found happiness together. Maybe their connection was real despite how wrong the circumstances were. Or maybe they were stuck in a relationship they'd sacrificed too much for to admit it was a mistake. Either way, Natalie and I had made our peace with having a mother who'd chosen her stepbrother over her family. We had Dad who'd rebuilt his life with grace. We had each other after years of rivalry. The family we'd grown up with was gone, replaced by something more honest and complicated. Sometimes finding the truth means losing the illusion you thought was your life. 4 years after everything, Mom sent Natalie and me a long email. She'd been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. She was starting treatment and wanted to repair our relationship before anything happened to her. The email was full of apologies and regrets and promises to do better. She acknowledged that her choices had hurt us and Dad. She said she understood if we couldn't forgive her, but she hoped we could at least stay in her life. Jamie wrote us separately saying Mom needed family support during treatment. It was manipulative, but effective. Natalie and I flew to Colorado for Mom's first chemo appointment. We sat in the hospital room with her and Jamie, watching them hold hands through the treatment. They looked older, worn down by the judgment they'd faced, but still united in their determination to stay together. During that visit, Mom finally told us the full truth about her and Jamie's teenage years. They had kissed once when they were 16, in the basement of the house their parents shared. They'd immediately felt guilty and agreed never to do it again. But the feelings stayed, and they'd spent the rest of their time as step-siblings in this strange state of denial and longing. When their parents divorced violently 2 years later, it was almost a relief because it meant they didn't have to see each other and be reminded of what they couldn't have. Mom said she'd married Dad partly to prove to herself she'd moved on from Jamie. But she'd thought about him constantly for 30 years, wondering what might have been different if their parents hadn't gotten married and made them siblings. The funeral had been her chance to find out. Hearing that story didn't make me forgive Mom, but it made me understand her better. She'd spent 3 decades with unresolved feelings that had probably poisoned her marriage to Dad in ways none of us had recognized. When she'd reconnected with Jamie, it wasn't just an affair. It was the culmination of 30 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. That didn't excuse her choices, but it explained them. She'd prioritized closing a loop from her youth over preserving her present. It was selfish, but it was also human in a messy, complicated way. Natalie and I stayed in Colorado for a week helping Mom through the worst of her first treatment side effects. Jamie was attentive and caring in a way that showed he genuinely loved her, stepbrother weirdness aside. Mom beat the cancer after 6 months of treatment. She came out of it thinner and quieter, but still with Jamie. We'd reached an uneasy peace where Natalie and I saw her a few times a year and maintained civil relationships with Jamie for Mom's sake. Dad and Patricia sent flowers when Mom finished treatment, which was more grace than Mom probably deserved, but was typical of Dad. The scandal had faded into family lore, the story everyone knew but mostly stopped discussing. Mom and Jamie's wedding photos gathered dust on their mantle. They'd built a small life together in Colorado, both working different jobs than before, both accepting they'd never have their family's full approval. They seemed content, if not happy. Maybe that was enough. 5 years after finding that phone behind the washing machine, Natalie and I could talk about it without the raw anger we'd felt initially. We'd both been in therapy processing the trauma of discovering our mother's affair and watching our family implode. We'd learned that people are complicated, that love and obsession can look identical, that sometimes there are no clear villains, just people making terrible choices for reasons they believe are valid. Mom had chosen Jamie over everything else. She'd accepted the consequences of that choice, lost her career and most of her relationships, and still maintained she'd made the right decision. Whether she actually believed that or just couldn't admit she'd destroyed her life for nothing was something we'd never know. What we did know was that finding those 200 texts had changed all of us. Natalie and I had gone from enemies to allies, learning we could count on each other when everything else fell apart. Dad had found real love with Patricia after years in a marriage with someone who'd never been fully present. Mom had gotten what she wanted, but at a cost she probably hadn't anticipated when she'd sent that first text to Jamie after the funeral. We'd all had to rebuild our lives around this new reality. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd never found that phone. If Mom had successfully hidden her affair and left Dad without us knowing why. The betrayal might have hurt less if we'd remained ignorant, but we'd chosen truth over comfort and had to live with everything that came after. On the 5-year anniversary of finding the phone, Natalie and I met for lunch at a new restaurant neither of us had been to before. We didn't mention the date's significance, but we both knew. We'd come through something together that had fundamentally changed us. We'd lost the mother we thought we had and gained each other. We'd learned that family can betray you in ways you never imagined, but also that you can survive that betrayal and build something new. Over coffee, Natalie raised her cup in a quiet toast. To finding the truth, even when it's ugly. I clinked my cup against hers. To surviving what comes after. We finished our lunch and went back to our separate lives, connected now by shared trauma and hard-won understanding. The phone was long gone, returned to Mom eventually, but its impact would last forever.